Hello, beautiful visionaries. This is Lorna Liana, and I am the host of the Entheonation podcast. Entheonation is a web show featuring visionaries who are pioneering the cutting edge of awakening. They are, through their work in psychedelic science, modern shamanism, and visionary culture. Now, the worldwide expansion of sacred plant medicine ceremonies beyond their cultural boundaries has been coined a global shamanic revival. Increasing numbers of Westerners are traveling to the Amazon, Central America, and Africa and many other places to participate in indigenous ceremonies, initiations, and festivals. This heightened interest in indigenous culture has fueled an indigenous cultural renaissance in the Amazon and elsewhere. Now, at the forefront of this global shamanic revival are Western teachers of shamanism, facilitators of plant medicine ceremonies, and neoshamans. Western participants in these events don feathers and face paint, often applied by the indigenous themselves. Yet underneath this fascination with indigenous culture, the roots of racism, colonialism, and cultural appropriation do persist. How can Western ceremony facilitators offer and be compensated for their services without perpetuating colonialism? How can Western practitioners of shamanism embrace indigenous culture without appropriating it? How can those who walk the path of plant medicine shamanism do so in right relation to the people who are the cultural guardians of these medicine traditions? Now, to explore these topics more deeply, we have a live panel with a number of panelists with a great deal of experience and both practical as well as in areas of social justice, in addition to shamanic practices, that are going to offer their perspectives so that we can have a really full conversation and explore some of the topics that are being conversed about in the shamanism space, and that do bring up some triggering emotions and a lot of anger and negativity. And so we're going to look and see, take a look at some of the dynamics that are creating these issues, so that we can understand them better, and so that we can collectively begin to, first of all, listen to each other, and then collectively begin to find solutions that will create a shamanic space that is inclusive for all. So to explore these topics further, I have with me Carlos Tanner, Program Director of the Ayahuasca Foundation, a nonprofit organization based out of Iquitos, Peru, who has been studying the science of plant spirit healing in the Amazon rainforest since 2003. Would you like to wave?
Hi. Thanks for having me, Lorna.
Great. Next up, we've got Lola Medicine Keeper, a shamanic healer who offers ceremonies, rituals, and perspectives from her teachers in Peru and Mexico, as well as her ancestral lineage from the Northern tradition. Next, we have Tony Moss. Tony is a visual recording artist, an event producer, founder of I.AM.LIFE, a nonprofit event production company focused on interconnectivity. And then we have Michael Stone, who is a shamanic practitioner, teacher, author, transformational coach, and organizational development consultant. His award-winning radio show, KVMR's Conversations, focuses on environmental, spiritual, and social justice issues. And so I do want to say for the record that, my team and I, we did make considerable effort to invite a native speaker to this live panel. But due to language considerations and travel schedules, we were not able to have an Indigenous panelist join us. However, the extensive cross-cultural social justice experience of the panelists today will certainly allow for a deeper understanding of these complex issues. And you can also hear individual answers to the same questions in many of the interviews that I've conducted for the Modern Shaman Mystery School series. To set the stage for this potent conversation, I would like to introduce a letter that was written by the indigenous leadership of Acre, Brazil, addressing their concerns around the commercialization of sacred plant medicines and cultural appropriation in the West. So I think it was maybe a year after the second World Ayahuasca Conference that took place in Rio Branco, Brazil, that raised a number of really deep, contentious issues in the communities between a lot of like challenging emotions were triggered, and and a lot of points of views were expressed from the Indigenous leaders that were present at the event, from the leaders of the Santo Daime churches, also the scientists and the policy advocates were also finding themselves very much in the crossfire of a lot of these tensions. And so what emerged from this really challenging conference and with many challenging conversations was a desire for the Indigenous to have their own event and to discuss these issues amongst themselves and come to a collective stand around some of the most important issues that they need to address as a community. So that event was called the first Yubaka Haira, the first Indigenous conference of Ayahuasca, which took place in the Puyanawa Indigenous Territory on the 16th of December 2017, and produced a letter of internal recommendation, inviting Indigenous communities in the Amazon, to the Brazilian Amazon, to reflect upon key concerns around the expansion of sacred plant medicines. The general content of the document points to a greater role for Indigenous peoples in a process where they feel that they have been pushed by interests outside the villages. So here are some of the key concerns for them. That researchers studying ayahuasca and other traditional medicines are not committed to the interest of the Indigenous movement, that they have legitimacy to speak in the academic sphere, but on spirituality, the Indigenous peoples are the true connoisseurs, and these people must be the cultural protagonists. They have concern about training courses on how to use sacred medicines, especially outside Brazil. They are concerned about the inadequate use of medicines by Nawas. Nawas are the non-Indigenous people, churches, and the commercialization of sacred medicines that may generate serious situations associated with this use. For example, the use of ayahuasca by Nawas in various parties and other spaces in tablet form as a psychedelic drug. That's interesting. I haven't heard about that, but that's interesting. The expansion of the use of medicines outside the Indigenous context has caused there to be more Nawas than natives using ayahuasca. Traditional medicines have specific uses. If they are used outside of context, even by the natives, they lose their meaning and cease to be effective. Reflection, they cast reflection on the responsibility of the Indigenous themselves for the transmission of knowledge of medicines to the Nawas. They feel also that there is disrespect by regulatory bodies regarding the movement of Indigenous people with medicine and other elements of culture. So in addition to some of the Western facilitators being apprehended by drug enforcement, some Indigenous leaders, who were traveling outside of Brazil with medicines are also encountering legal problems. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the notion of quote unquote diffuse rights that they feel undermines the Indigenous rights by putting Indigenous ayahuasca at the same level of use by churches and various other groups that are not Indigenous. Okay, so that is a lot to digest. And I will say for the record that, there isn't going to be a right or wrong answer, because the culture is changing and all of these things are indeed happening whether we like it or not. So I'd love to hear some of the perspectives from the panelists around these themes. So Carlos, let's start with you, since you are directing a school that does teach people, mostly Westerners, about the Shipibo ayahuasca tradition. Can you share with us a little bit more about what you guys do and how you feel about whether or not this is representative of cultural appropriation?
Right. Well, that was a very interesting letter for sure. I'm not sure if there was, agreement outside of Brazil. They seem to mention Brazil specifically. I assume that we could basically apply it to the Amazon region as a whole. But yeah, we do offer courses that specifically teach vast majority of which are Westerners or non-Indigenous people exclusively. Not by choice. Indigenous people are welcome to do the course, but they typically don't do the course that we offer. And what that course was really a response to a phenomenon that I didn't agree with. Which I would classify as a level of cultural appropriation, or at least something that was not agreed upon by the indigenous people that I worked with and the curanderos that I know. And that was foreigners or people outside of the Amazon, Westerners, holding ceremonies that didn't have proper training, that didn't know what they were doing. Medicine that was known in the healthcare practice of the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, but without knowledge of how to use it appropriately or correctly, and essentially potentially putting people in danger. This was a reality. This was happening. I was seeing it more and more. There were more and more ceremonies, if you want to call that, or more and more people that were serving ayahuasca to other people in all the countries around the world. And I was worried about what might happen if people didn't have at least a basic understanding and the basic principles and a proper path to follow if they were going to be serving medicine. So the course, the concept for the course was really an attempt to make the people that are opening centers in different countries and serving medicine around the world better at what they're doing, at least having the proper understanding, the proper respect for the indigenous cultures that were the originators of these practices and of this wisdom. So that was the intent behind the course, and that's still what we do. In the last year, we had people that came to our center who have ayahuasca retreat centers in Europe, and yet they never had the training. And they already had a center, they were already serving medicine, they were already holding ceremonies. And I remember in the very first meeting, before the course even began, just the preliminary meeting, talking about the tradition. And one of the people who has this center said, I just realized that I'm not actually holding ceremony. Like, I've been serving medicine in my retreat center, and based on what you're just saying in this preliminary meeting, I realized that I'm not actually holding ceremony. And so he still has that center, but now he operates it with a greater awareness of the indigenous principles and continues down a path using those principles and that foundation. So to me, that's like, achieving the goal for sure. And that to me is why the curandero that I work with and I develop this course, and why we teach this course, is so that if people are going to be drinking ayahuasca, and they are, and that's just happening. I'm not making people drink ayahuasca around the world. They are. But at least they can be doing it in a safe way that respects indigenous wisdom and indigenous culture.
So are the instructors in your school, are they Shipibo?
Yes. I mean, the course is taught, well, this is going to be a very, I want to be as accurate as possible with my words, of course. And I think that this is actually going to become a big topic for discussion in this panel. But the true teachers of the course are plants and plant spirits. But the intermediary between the plant spirits that are actually leading the courses are Shipibo curanderos. And they are 100% indigenous curanderos from lineages, familial lineages within their own tribes, from 2 different familial lineages. And they teach the course, and they're assisted by we have a course running right now. So they're assisted by a woman from Portugal and a man from South Africa, both of whom who have completed the course and both of whom who have years of training with them as well to help to bridge the another gap between the indigenous to Western paradigms and understandings, and to also translate so that people can understand in the language that they speak, or English basically.
What is your response to people that say that your school is some type of 6-week shaman certification program?
Yeah, I mean, people don't know. My response is simply like, have someone that did the course. Clearly, they haven't done the course, and so you're just making up a story essentially about what it is,
Mm-hmm.
and what people that have done the course would say is like, are you kidding? Like, I know now, if I didn't know before, I definitely know now that I'm not prepared to do this. Not right now, but I have the foundation to practice and to keep going forward. Now, some people that do the course, like I said, some people have been working with medicine for 10 years already and have 10 years of diets, and those are the interesting people to see, because they do the course and they realize that they didn't have adequate training. And, I think that it's a real eye-opener for people to really see what it means and what the path really means. And by no means are we saying like, hey, you've done a couple months, so now you're ready to go. It's the exact opposite. We're saying, hey, you've done a couple months, so now you see what it's really like. Now you see what the reality is, and that this isn't something that you can learn in a couple months. And that again is like another response to people that come down to Peru, or maybe not even come down. They have experiences on their own or in some way with ayahuasca in a very short time, think that ayahuasca has given them a message, which could be very valid, that the path is meant for them, but interpret that in a way that they feel like, I'm going to start doing this right now, without proper training, without proper understanding, and without the tools and the wisdom to actually do it in a safe and sustainable way, and with respect to the people that actually develop the practices. So those are the things that we're like responding to with our course. But yeah, of course, I've heard that criticism before, and none of the people that have criticized it have ever done a course or even talked to people who have done. If they did, they would have a better perception.
Mm-hmm. So Lola, you being a ceremonial space holder in the West, what do you think about Westerners that are holding ceremonies in locations that are far away from the cultural origin? How would you? What do you think about that phenomena, and how would you approach being in right relationship to the ancestral wisdom keepers, even if you are living far, far away and maybe never really spent much time with them?
I think Carlos brings up excellent points about what a responsible ceremony facilitator brings to the experience. And that level of learning, I think, is a critical component of being in right relationship with the medicine, because it's a sign of respect. It's not just a message beamed down from the medicine that gives you permission. Then there's this course of personal investment, of energy, of time, of attention, of humility, to really understand the ins and outs, not only of the medicine itself, but the medicine space, the psychological effects of the medicine, diagnostic tools so that you can make sure you're working with people in a responsible way. There's so much to this work, far beyond setting up a circle of seats and serving medicine to drink. There's many, many complex issues with it. I have a personal relationship with medicines that are from my local area. So I do not work with medicines that are not from here, that I can't grow in my own yard, for example. And I think for me, that's really an important differentiation. I know that's not how everybody practices. And so I encourage people who are on this path or who want to explore this path to really develop their own sense of an ethical compass. What feels right to you in your system, as you learn more and more about the local Indigenous practices, the local medicines, the practices abroad, the medicines that resonate, and you can form a sort of bridge between yourself, your locality, your passions, and perhaps things that call to you that are from outside your culture of birth. So there are a lot of ways to navigate this space, and I think that at the basis of all of it, it really requires an ability to be humble and an ability to listen. So if you have people coming to you saying, this isn't right for you to be doing, can you receive that with openness, listening, and respond to it from a place of heart-centeredness versus ego and need to defend? That's a really important skill to develop. And I think it's a skill that medicine helps us develop. It's one of the reasons why it's important in these times for many people to work with these medicines in various ways, because it brings this aspect of humility. It brings this deep down, high up wisdom that's so far beyond our human experience that it helps us see how powerful our egos have become and how much it can be in service to each other to develop a skill of deep listening and not knowingness. And so if you're bringing that to the table for your ceremony spaces, if you're bringing education, if you're bringing an authentic, heart-centered, rooted, grounded alignment, that space is going to feel a whole lot safer for everyone who's in it. And that safe space is critical.
Do you think that Western facilitators owe it to the tradition to travel to the country of origin? For example, if they are a Western facilitator of ayahuasca, should they go to Brazil or Peru, and should they actually try to go there often?
I don't love the word should, but my personal stance on this is that it is of huge benefit to explore these medicines in their context as much as possible. So when you take something out of context like ayahuasca and serve it somewhere else without having had the experience of it in the place of its birth, in the place where it's been carried by these medicine keepers for thousands of years, you're somewhat removed from those roots of the medicine. That's not to say that it's not going to be effective, but there's a bit of a difference in those experiences. I mean, a bit is kind of generous. There's a huge difference in those experiences. So I think if you're going to be a practitioner, again, that investment piece comes in. Yes, it's hard. It's hard to pony up the money for a plane ticket or take the time away to go into these places. But that's also part of our humility. And as Westerners, we have a lot more privilege to be able to make those choices. And I think it's a sign of honoring versus an owing. I think there's a different energetic there. If we honor the cultures versus feeling like we owe them something. Yes, there's a lot of damage that's been done by colonialism. If we can step outside of that owing relationship where we're unequal and instead look to honor, it reframes it a bit.
Thank you so much for that. So Tony, you were at the Second World Ayahuasca Conference and witnessed some of the tensions that emerged. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are about some of these Indigenous concerns and whether or not there is a way forward. I mean, it almost at some point seemed like the Indigenous leadership really, I would wonder, like, are they just rejecting the Europeans altogether? Are they saying, no, we're going to do it our way? And is there a way forward towards collaboration? So would love how you processed all of that.
It was a very interesting dynamic. At the core of it, what I was noticing was just the perspectives. What seemed to be really a clash was an academic kind of dry, very linear approach to the medicine versus a spiritual one. And this idea kept coming up of ownership. Ownership meaning where do we attribute the roots to? And so there was a lot of tension. One of the things I think that really struck me was that there would be a question, and there would be maybe 5 or 6 panelists answering it from an academic perspective. And then when it gets to the Indigenous person, they would almost always blow off that question and just go right to the core of what they actually wanted to speak about, which had to do with really basic things, like respecting the medicine, sustainability, this idea that ownership, meaning for them, not being, their roots not being acknowledged. So the tensions seem to be more around that. Individually, the Indigenous leaders and representatives that I spoke to at the conference, unanimously, all of them actually were in favor of the evolution of the medicine as it was evolving in the West. They were just concerned about, and not using this language, what we've touched on already, the commercialization and the lack of proper respect and the lack of right relationship. So my response to all of that, having said that, is we're looking at something that is relatively new. The emergence of ayahuasca as a global phenomenon is new, and it is an evolution. And as the panelists have spoken already, what's crucial at this point, before it starts to expand even beyond what it has already exponentially, it is to go back to the roots. It's understanding the origins, understanding what right relationship looks like. Obviously, with a key towards sustainability, not only sustainability of the actual growing of the plant, but sustainability culturally. That a lot of the tribes are, some of them, of course, are getting really, really popular and doing well financially. Also, I think it's brought a lot of attention back to the value of their culture, so there's been some really beautiful aspects of it. So I think the word sustainability and right relationship is applicable not only to how the medicine is being grown and distributed, but which is, I think, the main topic of our conversation here is to what degree sustainability overlaps into respect and what the word would be. I like that idea of the difference between honoring and owing. I don't think it's that Western people owe something to Indigenous people. I think that's inherent in right relationship. That if we're in right relationship with the plants, I think the appropriate respect and maybe even reciprocity is going to flow naturally from that.
So what would right relation and reciprocity look like to you, Tony?
It's interesting. It varies. For instance, I use the example of the centers that are springing up. There's obviously some really good ayahuasca centers, and I know because people have gone and had amazing experiences, a lot of deep healing. The centers that are being conscious about where the medicine is extracted, how it's grown, that Indigenous people are part of the program, that they're informing the program itself, and that the money from the centers is somehow trickling back into the community in some way. That's one of the ways I think we look like, from the Western perspective, right relationship would look like. A deeper right relationship, of course, is teaching Western people what right relationship means, which is to actually be in a respectful and, I would say, kind of knowledgeable relationship, with the plants that you're working with, as opposed to, chasing after every traveling shaman just to really just have an experience. I would say to trip, yeah. As a community overall, the medicine community that I've encountered anyway in the last 10 years, I see a lot of right relationship actually. There's certainly a lot of rogue, individuals that are, from an egoic place, just want to be the shaman and the healer and want the popularity and power that comes with that. But overall, what I've seen is a great attempt on Western people to grasp and understand and have a relationship with something that is relatively new and foreign.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you so much for those thoughts. So, Michael, as the host of the Global Shamanism Summit, I would love to ask you your thoughts about what cultural appropriation actually is, and if you have any thoughts on the in the space, I couldn't help but notice there's a lot of white, Caucasian, European descent teachers of shamanism, and so they're teaching spiritual techniques that they may have learned from other cultures. Would this be considered cultural appropriation? Oh, hey, you need to unmute yourself, Michael. Hello, Michael, can you hear?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. I have to shut myself up once in a while. I just appreciate the wisdom and contributions of the panel and the fact that we have so many people tuning into this conversation. And I appreciate your question. I want to take it a little bit away because we're kind of ayahuasca focused here and look at the bigger picture of the traditions. I love, Carlos, what you brought up about it's the plants. And you know, my particular background, I am a white privileged male. But my background is one of Druidism and Celtic shamanism, and I've obviously talked to a lot of people doing the summit every year. So so I want to talk about some of the areas like race and how that applies. But I think at the very beginning, it has a lot to do with permission and integrity. Wherever you look, has someone been given permission when you're entering a particular tradition, and to honor the different traditions that we have, because they're quite complex. One of the things that hasn't been mentioned is the ancestral area. And, you know, we come from a long line of ancestors, and we have this period of colonialism, which has come up with the race card. And the race card is really a colonial artifact that says, you know, that was used to dominate people over the last, 500 years particularly, and created huge mischief and decimated many cultures, longer than that, really. So permission, not just at the level of the people who are now practicing the tradition and carrying some of the complexities of the tradition, which aren't always cross-cultural. They don't always fit over. And sometimes people will appropriate and take a part of a tradition and not honor some of the sacred ancestral songs and spirits and prayers and the things that made that particular tradition powerful. So I think that's an important aspect, is looking with integrity, and do we have permission from the carriers of the lineage? And I think as a white privileged person, there's a certain demand on us going beyond the beyond, you know, someone of that tradition. But it's not about color. You know, I have friends who are in the Orissa, the African shamanism, and they're white, and they've been embraced and brought into that. So, and just because you're black and you go to Africa and you think you're going to be accepted for some reason because of the color of your skin is ridiculous. You're not part of the tradition that's being carried any more than a white person going to a Sami and tradition and saying you should accept me because I'm white. Or Celtic, whatever it is. So this race thing is really a perpetuation of colonial racism through colonialist tradition, because it's never about the color of a person's skin. And so I think that's an issue that comes up a lot and uses the race card, and that's just another aspect of using a colonial fabrication to get religious or white supremacy or power, racism, sexism, genocide. It's something that justifies that in a way. So, but the traditions are steeped in people's blood ancestors, and I guess the key there is being aware of that, being open to it, and doing, as Lola was talking about, deep listening, the really deep listening that goes beyond just listening as a self-centric identity or a white identity or a black identity, or, you know, it's way deeper than that. I spent a number of years with the Gestalt Institute and a number of people in postgraduate work studying cross-cultural relations. And I remember with 21 different countries represented in our 40 people that work together in different countries around the world. And I remember a woman from South Africa, and I tried everything I knew about right communications, to connect with this person over a 2.5 year process, and listened, and I would repeat what she said, and I'd think about what she'd say, and I'd pray about what she said. And at one point, she said to me towards the end of our time together, "Yes, you're saying the words, but you just can't understand what I'm saying. You don't know what I've been through and my ancestors have been through." And that's absolutely true. I did not, as much as I tried. So that kind of deep heart listening and tuning into your well ancestors and your helping ancestors, I think is important to begin to understand the depth of some of these traditions and the complexity of the tradition, and to honor the cultural integrity. When we do have something, do we have permission, and are we doing it intact as the ancestors of this tradition would want us to do? So I think that's a major aspect, to know what's involved and not skip steps in it, and miss the agreements of the traditions. Some traditions are very outgoing, and they really want to bring other people in, and other traditions don't want to bring people into that. And I think that should be respected. If you're invited in, then participate in that. So there's also a tradition, an argument around, should I charge? Should I not charge? How much should I charge? Well, it depends on the tradition again. There's sacred reciprocity. There's Aini to pay attention to. What is the tradition? If I'm working with an African tradition, I pay for the training, but I also support them, because those cultures need the support. They expect to be supported. They expect that kind of exchange. If I'm in a Lakota tradition, say, they don't do that. There's still a reciprocity, but it's a different tradition. But racism is not part of the lens from my perspective. There's so many different areas here.
So let me just kind of clarify. So racism is not part of the lens. So I'm not sure if I'm understanding you clearly. So I want to clarify. Are you saying that, by making racism part of the conversation, does that actually perpetuate the racism?
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I was saying, racism is a product of colonialism. It's not about color. If anything, I would look at place as a more important aspect, relationship to the plants and the land. If you take an animistic perspective, it's not about color. It's not even about culture. So when we use these terms, we perpetuate racism. Ultimately, we're looking at lineages that want to unify. If you take it, I've done a lot of work on matching traditional wisdom, wisdoms. I'm not going to say just shamanic wisdoms, but the enlightened wisdoms that have been saying certain things for a long time. And if you look at the quantum worldview right now, you see that the quantum worldview, which could be something that could really allow us to jump into what I would call unity consciousness, is that everything is connected and everything affects everything else. That the nature of the universe is uncertainty, to embrace uncertainty. In other words, to give up having to be right, having to know, and a self-centric identity. This is why I like animism as my basis, because everything is alive, everything has a spirit, everything affects everything else. We're looking for coherence. The universe is coherent. Everything is in alignment with itself. Humanity is not. We aren't even present for the most part. Presence doesn't go anywhere. It's just we're not there most of the time. And so...
Okay. So I'm going to move the conversation along. So do you want to complete your thought before I ask other folks to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm done.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So I would love to ask your thoughts about this, Tony, about how the conversation about racism perpetuates racism?
It's such a complex issue, and you and I touched on it in our conversation too. First I acknowledge what's obvious, like me being an African American man who has dedicated the better part of his life to plant medicines. The reason is, a little background, is that all of us, obviously, no culture has been untouched by some form of trauma. In my case specifically, African American people and slavery, colonialism. And what I found early on with my plant medicine work was nothing else that I had worked with was more effective at getting me to not only the roots of my own personal trauma, but in all the subtle ways it was playing out in my own personal life and just culturally, in America. So it's an interesting topic, the one of racism, and our conversation, you and I, was Ayahuasca and the racial divide. What I'll say about that instead is that what's most fascinating and what most comes up in conversations like this is the idea that once again, we have this amazing healing modality, the plant medicines in general, in my case specifically ayahuasca, that come from indigenous people, but in the West, most of it is not being administered by or perpetuated by people of color, and most people of color don't even know what it is, let alone have access to it. Yeah. So it's true. I have found that the very conversation about racism in the plant medicine world, which is not owned by any particular culture, but certainly brought forth and cultivated by particular cultures, it comes down to the plants. I love what Michael was saying. It's really about, and Lola, deep listening, being willing to be humble enough to do your homework, and offer these healing modalities in a way that is respectful and accessible to the particular culture you're working in. And that's where the appropriation gets really tricky. It's not going to do much good for me to do a completely authentic, to the letter, let's say, Shipibo ceremony in Chicago with a group of beautiful Black people, right? What I need to do is to modify that, in some way so that the potency of the particular modality can actually reach the people that I'm working with. Yeah, so I don't find that there is a lot of racism in the traditional sense in the plant medicine world, because most people that are really working with these plants with integrity bypass that. But it's similar to what Michael is saying, the very conversation about it seems to perpetuate it. And I will close this section by saying, I got to say, most of the people I've encountered in the last 10 years who are concerned about appropriation are people that haven't studied and actually, I say this affectionately, really don't know what they're talking about. Meaning they're very new to the plant medicine tradition or to shamanism in general, and they're imposing, their very approach to appropriation is actually appropriation, right? They have these meaning they have these very romanticized ideas about what tradition looks like and how it should be administered. And if they would actually study, and not only study with indigenous people, but study what's happening in the plant medicine world and shamanic world in general, they would find out that there's far less appropriation than I think is what's being imposed upon the movement.
Well, I want to just also ask another question of you, Tony, which is, kind of touches upon the greater conversation around racism, because I do hear this a lot, like, oh, you talking about racism means that, you're perpetuating it, you are being racist by bringing up racism. And I find it really kind of interesting because, sure, if racism came from colonialism, at what point did the vestiges of colonialism actually completely go away? We still do have systemic discrimination, in Western cultures, against, minorities and, people of color. And so, I feel like it's very difficult to address the inequality without addressing the elephant in the room, without calling it out for what it is. And so both you and I know that, in the, shamanic world, and, it's also, how does one define shamanism? That's a whole other conversation, so a lot of, people's concepts around what shamanism is, native cultural practices, the indigenous people do not consider themselves to be practitioners of shamanism. So, there's that aspect. But one thing that I can say I've observed in the Western world is that it seems like the demographics of the people that are participating are predominantly of Western origin. So, how do we create more inclusiveness?
Yeah, it's, you and I have spoken about this, and the reason I accepted the opportunity to be a more public spokesperson for plant medicines was, harkening back to what I said earlier, I saw really clearly that working with plant medicines across the board, in my case specifically ayahuasca, could really help people heal from what they're mostly dealing with, which is trauma to some degree. And it became really apparent, particularly the first 10 years, this is my 24th year, most of the ceremonies I would attend, regardless of where, I was usually the only Black person in the room, and let alone just person of color. So what's really fascinating to me is that once again, we're looking at something that the people of color, I'll say in my case particularly, African-American people have a rich culture of working with what we're now calling shamanism and plant medicines. Because of colonialism, that was taken away, not only taken away really aggressively, but made taboo and wrong. So most people of color that I encounter now, most, let's just say Western white people, are very open to the possibility of working with plant medicines as a healing modality. Most people of color I've met have not, or they're not. And the reason that overall that I can discern so far is because something that was actually part of their indigenous roots has been taken away and distorted, and now made to be something, again, taboo and quite frankly wrong. I was raised Southern Baptist, and most Christian Southern Baptist people that I meet, the idea that I'm working with plant medicines sounds to them, without even questioning, exactly what I'm doing, that I'm actually moving into the dark side. One guy wrote on the Amber Lion video, where I'm talking specifically about my experience of meeting my ancestors. In the comment line, he wrote, "Those weren't your ancestors, those were demons. You should read your Bible." Yes, it had absolutely nothing to do coherently with anything that was being discussed in the interview, but it was a very eye-opening comment for me, that anything at all that had to do with plant medicine work, shamanic work, is seen by a lot of people of color as weird, and at the very worst, evil.
All right. Thank you for sharing your observations about that phenomenon. So Lola, I'm wondering, from your perspective, is there anything that Western shamanic practitioners and ceremony facilitators can do to increase the racial inclusiveness of the communities that they serve? So is it a function of, hey, the only people that are coming to me for ceremonies and shamanic services are white? Or is it simply a matter of, offering sliding scale? Or, what can be done to kind of diversify the demographic?
I think it's a multi-pronged approach. This work is word of mouth primarily, right? Because it's not oftentimes fully legal. So you are reliant upon your community spreading the word about the work that you're doing. And if your community is not diverse, then the word is going to spread only among people who look a lot like each other. And the way to break out of that is to cultivate diversity in your community. So it doesn't start in ceremony, it starts in the community. And so we look to, how can we be more inclusive with our groups of friends? How can we get more diversified? How can we branch our interests out? Where are the interests that are broader, so that we can start to connect with very different types of people and create those networks, so that when somebody says, hey, I see you've experienced something really difficult, I know someone who's holding a circle with very effective healing work that can help you with that, if you're open to it. And so that's one side of it. And I think the pricing is another side of it, because we have this perception, particularly in white America, that you get what you pay for. And so many people are pricing their ceremonies at very, very high prices, so that the perceived value of the work is equivalent to the actual value of the work, because that perceived value relationship with money is so high. And so one of the ways we can kind of start to deprogram that is to make our ceremonies more affordable, to make it not something that as facilitators we're financially motivated to hold. If it's not super profitable for you, you're going to be less inclined to accept people who are not ready for the work, who can't show up. You're more open to the people who do need deep healing and perhaps can't afford those higher price points. And there maybe is other opportunity in the rest of your work to supplement that income in ways that are more profitable for you. So, while I think that compensation is very, very important, and right relationship and exchange is very important for ceremony work because that personal investment does make a difference, it doesn't have to be one that breaks you or makes it only available to a certain echelon of people.
Mm-hmm. Got it. All right. So, Carlos, I'm curious to know racism and shamanism in Peru. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and because I work very, very closely with indigenous healers, and I would say that across the board, I do feel like there is racism, especially in Peru. In a weird way, it's complicated. There is a term in Peru, actually, that's kind of very well known. If somebody's doing something that you think is stupid, you call them an indio, which is essentially calling them an Indian, calling them an indigenous person as a derogatory term referring to like a lack of intelligence. And that's a term that people use freely in towns and cultures, not indigenous people don't use that, but it's a reference to indigenous people. And, we could maybe relate to it based on our age. Like when I was a little kid, people used to say something was gay if we thought that we didn't like it or something. And that still exists now. It would be very rare to walk into a bank in Peru and see an indigenous person working there. And even the scale of color of skin tends to be dictating some sort of class. Like if you went into a bank, for example, the teller would be very light-skinned, but the security guard would be darker-skinned in general. Like you could notice that those differences. When it comes to the indigenous people, I definitely feel like they are, like there is prejudice against indigenous people. They are perceived in many ways to be less intelligent or somewhat savages. Some of the tribes were literally called savages, but then there's kind of the other side of it where there is also like this great respect for them, and there is also this belief that they are much smarter than us and that they are much more connected and have that system of beliefs that we lack or had taken away from us. And there is this great reverence for them as well among the Peruvian people as well. So I don't know if you could say across the board. I think that definitely examples of indigenous people themselves feeling that they are superior to non-indigenous people, especially with regard to the medicine. Like a comment like, well, that person is doing great and they're on the great path, but they're not indigenous. So, there's only so far that they're ever going to go. And all of that is happening, and honestly, I think that's probably just happening everywhere in the world. I like to see that there is this great reverence, and I like to see that I feel like there's a new generation of people that are looking towards indigenous people as the people that never had that ancestral cultural tradition taken away from them, that still were able to hold on to, if not that.
Carlos, we lost you. You dropped out for a little bit. Can you rewind and start from the beginning of your sentence? Yeah, we can hear you now.
It was something that Tony touched on. He was referring to like African Americans or Africans just in general, like being a culture that was really connected to plants. And I want to put that into a global perspective, to be honest. Like humans were all connected intimately to plants and plant traditions and spiritual traditions. And yet most of them were taken away. Like the majority of culture around the world had them taken away. And I'm not sure if you call that colonialism. I definitely feel like the church, which Tony touched on, was kind of a big proponent of that. And just to like toss in a little side note, Jesus Christ was definitely a plant teacher. If you want to look at the ingredients of the anointing oil, it contained 5 plants that he bathed people in, and plant baths are still a part of the indigenous tradition today, a very important part. So anybody that wants to criticize like getting in touch with God through plants, definitely do read your Bible. Read it well. Read Exodus and read the ingredients for the anointing oil. You'll figure out that Jesus was a plant doctor. But the point is that we, regardless of our race, regardless of our culture, the majority of people on earth had something taken away from our ancestry. Literally, the word spirit was like removed from our cultural paradigm or the global paradigm, and it seems like it was a concerted effort to do so. But thankfully, small pockets of people and indigenous people preserved it. They didn't have it taken away. It didn't touch them. It couldn't reach all the way into the jungle, for example, or into some remote regions where those people were, or the people were so devoted to it that they wouldn't let it be lost. And that's a classic story within some of the indigenous tribes of the Amazon too. Many of the indigenous tribes in the Amazon also lost a big portion of their cultural paradigms, but some of them kept it, some of them held on to it, some of them understood just how important it was. And we as humans are so fortunate to still have those people in our presence. And the plants want us to have that connection again. Like the plant spirits aren't saying, I'm only going to talk to this small group of people. It's totally opposite. They want to help everyone because essentially the plants are part of an ecosystem that we are a part of too. We are all one giant being. And the plants aren't going to look and say, oh, great, all the human beings are destroying us. Awesome. Like, I'm going to tell this handful of people and hopefully the rest of the world will stop. No, they want to get their message out. They want to get their message to everyone that can possibly hear them, that they are there, first of all, because that's been removed. Like, we don't understand the concept that, like, if there is a racism, or what, is there a term yet? A speciesism? Because that's really what that we should be looking at, is speciesism. We have such a low regard in general. The human race does not respect plant spirit beings at all. And shamanism and the resurgence of the shamanic revolution is, to me, a revolution of equality, to bring plant spirits and plant beings as a whole back to the equal status, or even beyond that, because really, plant spirits are our elders. Evolutionarily speaking, on a global scale, plants have been here for hundreds of millions of years longer than human beings. They are our elders. They hold all of the wisdom, and they literally make us. We are literally made of plants and plant energy. So respecting plants and listening to the spirits of plants, that is the core concept. Communication with plants is the core concept of shamanic tradition. And that was the practice that all of our ancestors, regardless of race, regardless of whatever, wherever, ancestors practiced shamanism and communicated with plant spirits. And the revival of that should not be dictated or reserved to any particular culture. It cannot be owned by any particular culture. It is the divine right of the planet Earth, and we are a part of the planet Earth. The communication of the Earth to its own cellular behavior is essential for the health of the Earth. And that's what shamanism is. It's the communication of the whole to its parts to maintain health, harmony, and happiness. And that's what we should be talking about.
Okay.
Somebody
Thank you so much for saying that.
Ashe, yeah.
Couch.
Or
All
in
right.
plain English, that's good shit.
All right. So, just in the limit, in the concern of time, I want to go round robin really quick on a topic that probably isn't a very quick topic, but do your best, and then we're going to go into QA from the audience. So,
Lorna, can I say a couple things back to some of the concepts there? You have time for that, or
yeah, sure. We just keep it concise if you can.
Okay, good.
All right.
So just a couple things I want to bring up. So, particularly, I love what you were saying, Tony, and I just want to honor that. And if somebody heard that I was saying there is no racism, that's absolutely not what I was saying. It's embedded in our culture. It is institutionalized. I don't have to worry about DWB, right? Which most white people don't even know what that means, driving while black. I understand that there is race and it's embedded in there, but it is a colonial system that is wanting to be healed. And I love what you said, Carlos, because the plants are really calling. And when you look at it, the attraction of white privileged people to this is we have a lot to heal. We've got slavery, we've got genocide, we've got constant war, we're blowing up the bloody planet. So it is important to go to the basis of what Carlos so eloquently talked about, putting it in there. So and let go of this racial inclusiveness. North America and Americans have an enormous burden that needs to be healed and is impacting. And, we are impacting the cultures, the Karo Nation, which really lived, for instance, in a unity world, has been destroyed over the last 20 years by the influx of people. And yet, they have so much to offer in the sense of unity. So, I'll keep it short. I just wanted to make that one point at least.
Okay, thank you. So round robin, we're going to go back in the other direction. Shamanic teachings and shamanic healing should be free. Carlos, go.
No, I definitely disagree with that. I don't think that anything is free. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And unless everything is free, I'm all for that. Let's make housing free. Let's make food free. Let's make every single thing be free. In which case, definitely, I'm all for having medicine be free as well. But as soon as someone is going to devote their time and in many cases their entire life to something, they deserve compensation for it. There needs to be a reciprocation for that energy. In many cases, a curandero is giving so much of themselves to someone else, and if they don't get something back, then they will get sick. They will eventually lose their own energy. And we don't talk about that when someone comes to fix your plumbing. We never think you should be fixing my plumbing for free. We never think that when we go to buy some clothing. You never say, hey, this clothes should be free. Even though clothing and housing people and, having access to water, all of those things are very, very important also. And I think the difference is because we are such spiritually devoid people in our culture. Our consciousness lacks spirit. It's not at the core of our consciousness. It's something that we have to go do. We have to go reach for it. And therefore, when we encounter something that has spirit in it, it becomes spiritual. And then all of these other concepts are thrown around that are based on what we think of as spirituality or what this is, like religion, for example. And to me, that's what complicates it. We turn it into spirit, when the reality, in my opinion, is that spirit should be the core of our understanding. Everything should be understood to have spirit. And if that was the case, then plumbing would be an art form, and it is. Shout out to the plumbers, because it is an art form. artists are, and just the way that musicians are, and just the way that healers are. They're all artists that devote their lives into understanding and practicing an art form. And just because there is spirit involved in art doesn't mean that that makes it free.
Okay, Lola, shamanism, shamanic healing, shamanic teaching should be free. What do you think?
No. And here's why, beyond what Carlos shared, is that we are not really looking at anything. People who challenge that are often looking at things on an experiential basis. I'm going for this one experience, and this one experience should not cost more than X, or it should be X amount of dollars, because any more than that, and it's ridiculous. It's only 2 hours. It's only 6 hours. How can it be that much? But we're not looking at the whole gestalt of what has brought that experience into being. All of the training, all of the lineage, all of the deep listening, all of the humility, all of the personal healing, also all of the investment on the part of the practitioner. And that's particularly true in the West, where if you are in integrity, you are constantly educating yourself. You're going to ceremonies, you're traveling, you are working on your healing from a number of different aspects. And healing does need to be looked at as a proper investment. It's not something that should be put aside. Like Carlos said, it's an integrated part of a healthy human existence. So I think our approach, our attitude about that of healing being free comes from the fact that plant medicines, healers, herbalism, all of these ancient methods of healing ourselves and talking to spirit have been denigrated, devalued, destroyed. And so, of course, it's hard to perceive the value of that thing when it's been absolutely erased. So, in effect, paying for our ceremonial work, for our healing work, working with qualified people is a way to heal that disconnect. It's a way to say, this is important. This is where I'm voting with my dollars. I'm saying that I'm putting this back on an equal plane in my life, and that's a revolution of consciousness.
Wonderful. Thank you. Tony, shamanism should be free.
Absolutely not. And, I could just ditto everything that Carlos shared. And the main point being that people don't expect to go to a doctor that has spent a good part of his life training, to be proficient at what he does, and expect it to be free. And like you said, if unilaterally it was all free, I'm all for it. Fantastic. But compensating people who have dedicated their lives to being able to authentically and proficiently basically give you what you're coming for, which is psycho-spiritual work or deep healing at some level, absolutely should be compensated for. Otherwise, we'd have no one doing it. It wouldn't be available.
All right, I'm going to kind of switch this up a little bit, Michael, for you, and say, the best shamanic teachings are free. The best, yeah. If you're paying a lot of money, it's not good. So the best ones are free.
The best ones are free. Well, I don't agree with that necessarily. But just to go to the issue there, money is energy. Energy needs to flow. If it doesn't flow, it gets stagnant. We live in a growth, an economic system that's a growth system, which is destroying the planet. So in the best of worlds, we would have a gift economy that actually worked, and we would trade. But the system has gotten out of hand, and it's perpetuating the destruction of the earth and all life on the planet. So, it's really to be really aware of how we use money and give money in relationship to these things. It's something that I think you have to really be aware of what you're doing with money. And when you give to something, it's given, the bundle of it. If you give it from a place of scarcity to the people, you're perpetuating scarcity. If you give it from a place of gratitude, you're opening up and you're being more present because you're grateful and you're honoring your own ability to connect with someone and our deep interconnection with others and the web of life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Okay, folks, we're going to go into questions from the audience here. So, audience, down on the panel control bar, you're going to see that there's a little Q&A box. You can pop your questions in there. If you ask a question, I will see it show up in the open tab, so we can go do it that way. Or we could, if you have a hard time figuring that out, then you could pop a question into the chat. So does anybody have a question that they would like answered by anybody in this panel? You can just type it in there. You don't have to get on air or anything and speak to the public. You can just type it in there if you'd like. Okie dokie. Let's see. So Nicole asks, what do you think is a good way to get more African/Black people involved with plant medicine?
So assuming that is being addressed to me, we just have
anyone. I'm sorry, say that again?
More visible.
So we need to have more Black facilitators?
Not necessarily. Yes, that would be fantastic. I work for Inclusivity Festival every year. We help produce that event. And one of the questions they were asking a few years back was, why weren't there more people of color there? And we basically showed them all their marketing. It's like, well, do you see any in the posters? You know, if you're Black particularly, and you don't see other Black people in the advertising for an event, you assume it's not an event that Black people are interested in or that you welcome at. So that's happening in the world of plant medicines too. The more visible people of color are that are receiving benefits from the medicines, particularly facilitators, the more people will feel welcome to come.
All right, great. Any more questions? All right. I'm sorry.
Could I say a couple things while we wait
absolutely.
for a question? I wanted to kind of branch off something that Tony was mentioning, which I thought was super relevant. And he was saying, you know, if you held a Shipibo ceremony in, I don't remember if it was Chicago, but like for for like a group of Black people, or just even just a group of Americans in Chicago, that the Shipibo manner, the Shipibo style would probably not be the best fit. And that's something that I think is really important. And I think that it does kind of touch on the original concept of the panel here about cultural appropriation. And it kind of also goes back to what I was saying about the small group of people that are left on the planet that still have that connection to their spiritual core identity or paradigm. And by learning and studying with the people that do have contact with plants and still have those direct communications, then that can create the framework for the development or the rejuvenation of shamanic traditions around the world. And it sounds like that's like maybe what happened with Lola as well. You know, it took actual interaction and experience with a shamanic practice that was still intact, that was still holding on to its core identity and spirit, for her to then be able to use some of those principles and connections to connect with her other ancestral traditions or her own personal ancestral traditions, and as well begin to communicate with, like she said, the plants in her own backyard. And that to me is like why it's so incredibly valuable for all of the human race to really gain access to and learn from the indigenous people who still have this incredible wisdom and incredible connection. So I totally agree with Tony in the sense that the tradition needs to evolve. The tradition needs to adapt to the environment that it's going to be in, which guess what does that super well? Plants. And they adapt in an amazing way to the environment and work so well with whatever they have, and they find a way. And the word tradition, I think, for me, I had a lot of like trouble in my own evolution of understanding the word, because I feel like the general consensus of the word tradition means that it's done the same way, that it's always done. And that's just not the case. Even if you look at the indigenous cultures themselves and look at the history of their tradition, it's always changing, and it's changing now, and it's always adapting. In fact, the word tradition, I don't know if that's even the best word. I think science might be a better word, because science has in it, in the definition, that there will constantly be change and that there will constantly be improvement. There will constantly be abandoning old concepts for better models. And so if we're talking about the science of plant medicine, then yeah, definitely the science of plant medicine needs to spread around the world, and it's going to change, and the way it's practiced is going to be adapting to the environment, and that's just what needs to happen.
Okay, so some more questions have come in. Let's see here. So Izula asks, what could we do to support the sustainability of plant medicine being extracted from the Amazon?
Maybe I can take that one.
Oh yeah,
I'm sorry. I just went on a long rant. If someone else wants to talk, I live in Peru, so it's a little bit different. Well, there's a guy named Chris Killam. He calls himself the medicine hunter. He was just down in Iquitos and traveled around the Amazon, and he's doing a specific study on sustainability. And it was interesting, his findings, which was that there was already a path towards sustainability in place, and that we're working towards sustainability in a positive way. But how to encourage sustainability, it doesn't just have to be plant medicine in the Amazon. Working to sustain plant medicine around the world, taking cues from Lola, and maybe she can chime in right after me. Get to know the plants in your backyard. Get to know the plants in the park nearby. Get to understand, where all of that fits in, and become more connected and make that a bigger part of your life. And by doing so, you're helping to raise the consciousness of plant connection and to alleviate speciesism. And by doing so, that the consciousness will raise globally, and that will encourage sustainability from the core level.
Okay.
Absolutely. I can just piggyback on that a little bit. And I do think that by embracing our local ecology and learning about the indigenous traditions of plant medicine in our area, that can really provide a lot of exciting information and also deeply rooted connection to your ecosystem, which then makes it less of a draw to pull those resources from other places. I think this pattern of importation and exportation and kind of outsourcing our resources and pulling them in from other areas that are not local to us has been very damaging at a cultural level, at an ecological level, across the board. And while that's probably not going to be avoidable because we are a global culture and a global economy at this point, we can take the reins back and say, well, I'm going to look to healing plants from here. Or I'm also going to branch out beyond ayahuasca, because that's not the only medicine. Ayahuasca is not a magic pill, right? There's lots and lots of healing plants that are ready and waiting for integration into our modern lives. And that will help this issue, because if enough of us are thinking in that way, it brings a balance to the importation and exportation.
Okay, I'm going to pass this question to you, Michael. Sinead is asking, well, first of all, she says, thank each of you. So thank you from Sinead. She asks, after ceremonial healing, what are some tools for integration to get back into society and everyday life?
Well, I hope that isn't just looking at the hallucinogens in terms of that, because there's so many things that you can be in a shamanic ceremony and taken deeply into the shadow area that needs healing and be really disoriented when you come back out of any of those kinds of journeys. So I don't want to just talk about ayahuasca and those medicines, because traditional medicines could be song, could be prayer, could be journeying to the different worlds. In terms of integration, it's good to have a guide always. And sometimes our guides are our ancestral guides if we're in communication. And I think a lot of the conversations we have about the dangers of the things we're doing bring us back to a place of, are we in good health in our ancestral lineage? And are we honoring the helping ancestors to heal those who have not aren't fully well in the ancestral lineage, which includes most of our culture right now, and including the recent dead. So to have that kind of understanding and depth, and to have the wisdom of someone who has traveled the territory before. When I think of ancestral healing, one of the people that I highly recommend people know is Daniel Four, who's really gone in depth and has immense integrity in this area. So there is something about integrity with those who have gone before it, because the healing is for also our descendants. So that's first thing I would think to say about that area.
Okay, so I'm going to pass this question to Lola. Misty asks, what are good questions to ask individuals offering ceremonies to decide whether to sit with them?
First of all, how does your heart feel when you connect with that person, whether it's through their web presence, through a conversation over the phone or Skype or video or in person? Do you feel an immediate sense of both resonance and authenticity, as well as safety? That's going to be the first qualifier. Beyond training, beyond a history, a background, how does your heart feel? And that's a question to ask yourself, right? Because that's your discernment. And your discernment needs to be your most powerful guide in this process. If you are not using your discernment and not listening to your heart, no matter where you go and who you work with, you may not be in good hands, because you're not in your own good hands. So that's step number one. Step number two is just to really connect over, why are they on this path? What's motivated them to begin to offer this work in a ceremonial context? What are their experiences like? What are concerns that they've seen? Who maybe is not appropriate for this work? You also want to look at what their intake process looks like as an assessment. Are they asking you questions about your health history? Are they asking you questions about your psychological history or your other experiences with psychedelic medicines or entheogens? Are they asking questions that are going to help create a safe experience for you? And then you can go to the practical side and say, how long have you been doing this? What medicines do you work with? Who are your teachers? What's your lineage? Those things are important too. But first and foremost is your heart sense of the person and what they're doing to help create a safe experience for you by what they're gathering from you as far as information goes.
I would chime in on the web presence thing, because I've been bearing witness to some like flame wars in Facebook involving certain facilitators, and it does make me, when I see how the individual is showing up in the middle of these conversations, it does make me question as to whether I would want to be so open and vulnerable with this individual. So, do as much research as possible, and that includes online research too.
Can I just add on what I think it's brilliant what Lola says, and I completely agree. And I wanted to take it a little further, and that is that we live in a culture that's mostly disembodied, and we have more information than the Library of Alexandria in 50 trillion cells, each one with 50 trillion protons and neutrons spinning. There's this entire world in this 99.99% space that's happening here. And when we're not in our body and we're trying to journey, whether it's with entheogens or whether it's just shamanic journeying, it is not a disembodied experience. You take all your senses with you. Your heart, your chest, the wisdom of asking, is this true for me? It's right there in front of you. But we need to be in our body. And it's something that, I'm a 5 rhythms teacher, and I've been working with people for years to just get in your body. And we live in a culture that's heads on sticks. So I just want to underline that and broaden what you said, Lola, because it's brilliant. Thank you.
So last question before we wrap up, and thank you guys so much for being here with me for this time. I think this is a great question to conclude with. So Izula asks, and this is for anyone that wants to chime in, and I'll chime in as well. Is there a resource network of ceremonial practitioners and advocates that are in good relations with Native people? So Izula, if you have been participating in the events series, then what I would say is, check out the work of aniwa.co. These are individuals who I know personally who have as a mission to bring people to the Indigenous elders and bring the Indigenous elders to Westerners that want to connect with the culture, and they have a number of different types of retreats and experiences. Right now they are doing the Wirikuta pilgrimage, and they've brought a group of people, and they work with a number of the Indigenous wisdom keepers who I know and have known for years, and feel like they do really great work. So those are the folks that I know. Anybody else that wants to chime in on a good resource?
I'm the admin of the Facebook group, the Ayahuasca Facebook group, Ayahuasca World. There's 76,000 members of that. So I do often recommend that people, especially if they're looking for a ceremony in a particular area of the world, just to go on there and use that. And if you have, or if you want feedback about a particular organization or a particular person, there's 75,000 people, so chances are somebody else already does have experience, and you can get feedback in that regard. I would be know if I would even trust someone to put that list together. I think there's a lot of different ideas about what would constitute deserving to be on a list like that, and also get ready for all the people that you didn't put on that list to really enjoy your company, I guess you could say. But the Facebook group at least is a good way to connect with, and that's just for ayahuasca though, but it's a good way to connect with a lot of people all around the world.
Michael?
Well, it's kind of like asking Mark Zuckerberg to tell us what's real news and what's not. It's really, to go back to what Lola said, to follow your heart, to walk in beauty, and to go where you're called, to follow what you're being called to do, and then pay attention and honor the traditions. And you may be really surprised as to where you're called. So I think that's more important, is the calling, than getting, shamanism is a path of direct revelation. That means you're the one to, the inner voice to follow that. So that's what I would say about it.
Any other thoughts? I also want to put a couple other resources that I stumbled upon. I don't know if they're good. I don't know if there's, fake content on it or not. I haven't really checked out, but there's a site called Open Mind Trips, and it has, it's kind of like a Yelp style website that has different types of retreat centers that offer, entheogenic experiences with different medicines, and there, are people that, do customer reviews. And then there's also Aya.advisor.com, I believe, or .org, I'm not sure, but look for Aya Advisor, and that one seems to be specific for ayahuasca. All right, folks.
There's also Retreat Guru.
Oh, Retreat Guru.
Yeah, Retreat Guru, and they have a wide range of different programs, and it's also like the same style where you leave reviews, and then in ayahuasca there's also Ayamundo, which I think allows you to have direct communication with people that do leave reviews. So if you have a question to someone that went to the center, you can ask them directly. So
cool.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time, for your presence, for this enriching conversation. I want to wish you all the best. Thank you so much, attendees, for joining us. Really glad to have you. Thank you so much, panelists. Really glad to have you. And I want to wish you a beautiful rest of your day now. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
take care.